Well, that implies that you have to be drunk at all.
The new show 15. I'm Joe.
I'm Alan.
And I'm Dan.
And we're back, but we're not back. This is just a one-off Christmas present for everyone, so I hope everyone enjoys it. We haven't really got anything to plug. You can't really support us on Patreon because we've paused that at the moment. You could send us some money with PayPal if you really wanted to, but I don't expect anyone will. So let's just get straight on with the questions then. The first one, how much are you willing to spend on a bottle of wine?
I love these questions because my answer is always, it depends. And I know that probably annoys everyone. But for white, like a table wine, I feel like you can get away with a decent table wine for like $4. There's no real reason to, at least here, in California. For like a real good white, I don't think I really want to spend more than like $15, to be honest. It's like after that, there's not really any difference, I don't really think. And for red, some of my favorite reds are in the like $9 to $11 range. There's one I like that's like $19. I think I had one that was like maybe $25 that was really good, but I don't think that I've had any like, and obviously pay way more at a restaurant, right? So if I go out to a restaurant and I spend like $40 on a bottle of wine, I don't think that's really any better than the $11 bottle of wine that I've had at home, you know?
It's difficult because regularly I'll drink a bottle of wine that's like £8, something like that. And if I can find one that's £6, bargain, or if it's £8 discounted to £6, that's great. In my exuberant and extravagant youth, maybe I would have spent more. Maybe if I'm trying to impress someone, I might have spent a little bit more. If I'd already had a bottle of wine and I, was going to buy a second one and I was like, yeah, let's do it. Let's spend 50 quid on a bottle of wine. I don't think my taste buds are selective enough to be able to tell the difference between a 10 quid bottle of wine and a 40 quid bottle of wine. So that's partly why I won't spend a lot on a bottle of wine, is because I don't think I can personally tell the difference.
Well, it's the law of diminishing returns, isn't it? It's like that with anything in life. Trust me to make it about guitars, but you can spend £1,000 on a guitar and it's going to be really nice, or you can spend 10,000 or 100,000 and it's not going to be much nicer. And with wine, I don't know, where do you get to that point? Probably around £30, dollars or whatever for a nice red. Anything more than that, and you're just getting into just nuance, really.
That even seems high to me. I think that after about $15, it's all the same.
I used to think that until I had some really, really nice red wine that must have been about 40 or 50 quid. And it really, I didn't like wine before that. And I tried this and it was really, really nice. This was a really nice red wine. And after that, it got me kind of in the mindset of I don't mind wine. And now I will happily drink aeroplane red wine because I'm stuck on an aeroplane and it gets me pissed. But I do think it can be, for a special treat, it could be worth spending about 40 or 50. But any more than that, I just can't imagine that it would be. Now, maybe it would be. Maybe if you spend 200, 300 on some really ancient wine that's been stored properly and all the rest of it, maybe it's just going to totally blow you away, but I can't see myself ever spending that.
I don't know. This is California, so, we've got wine country. I've been to Napa, and there's little wineries, all around the hills, and I've gone and done wine tastings, and I'm always shocked by the prices they have on their bottles, because I really genuinely don't think it's that much better, even when they're like, oh, this is, award-winning, whatever, and we have at the state fair, all the wineries come together and you can try, stuff from everywhere. So I've got my favorite wineries, and there are some that are significantly better than others, but I just don't know that there's anything that's $30 that I would say that's like really worth it.
For topping up the cupboard over Christmas, I stopped off at a wine merchant on the way back from the shops the other day. And, I get the trolley and I go around and I grab 6 basically random bottles that are under a tenner in order to, fill a box, grab a bottle of port and a couple of other bits and bobs, and I'm done. And I didn't spend any particular time. It was basically the ones with the prettiest labels. And the wine I've had so far, yeah, quite delicious. Nothing remarkable, nothing disgusting, all pretty good. But while I was there queuing to pay, there was some pretentious wanker talking to the equally pretentious wanker of the shop, discussing all these different wines and the different styles and the tastes. And they were there for the entire time I was there, and probably some time before and some time afterwards. And I just thought, holy shit, I never ever want to be that guy. I never want to be the guy who basically buys monster HDMI cables, which is what I feel expensive wine is. It is the equivalent of audiophile wankery, and I hate it because there's no fucking way that that dick who's buying wine in that shop can tell the difference between the 50 quid bottle of wine and the 100 quid bottle of wine. I guarantee it. In a blind test, there's no way he will tell the difference. But I'm sure explaining it to all the lovies that he's giving this wine to, he will, espouse the benefits of this wine over that wine. Now, I'm being incredibly unkind to this person, but I don't care. People who buy expensive wine are dicks.
I don't know if it's just millennials don't care, but I don't think I've ever had a girl over that gave a shit what the wine was. They were like, you got wine? Cool. They know red or white, but I don't think I've ever impressed anybody with my wine selection. It's not, he has good wine. It's just like, cool, that'll get me drunk. Let's do it.
I don't know if that says more about you, the wine, or the girls you date. I can't quite figure that out.
I don't think it matters, man. I don't think my generation gives a shit.
I have this with people who are into anything to too much of an extent.
Like guitars.
Yeah, but you don't hear me going on about the specifics of them all the time and boring you, do you? Or do you?
No.
I'm sorry, every analogy is a guitar analogy, so...
Well, it's better than a fucking car one.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, well, I'm sure, if you have people over and you play them a song and it's a lovely song or whatever, they'll be like, oh, that was great, Joe. Can we turn the radio back on?
That was a great song, Joe, but could you play it on a different guitar, please?
Yeah. Well, no, it's more like if people came over and I got my guitars off the wall and started talking about this one's got an ABR1 bridge and that one has got a Nashville-style bridge, people just wouldn't give a flying fuck about that. And, whereas, look at my guitars, isn't that one beautiful? Oh, yeah, it is. End of conversation. People who are into wine just go on and on about, the notes and all this bullshit that I just don't care about. Is it nice? Will it get me pissed? Job done. If you were in an episode of Quantum Leap and you could go back to influence the Linux desktop, when and what change would it be? And this is from Rex. Rex, you may not remember Quantum Leap too well, but he didn't have much say in when and where he went. But let's assume that you can.
Alan, what year was it that you guys were supposed to drop the System Tray API? Was that 2014, something like that?
I think you'll find it's not called a system tray. I think we finally call it an indicator area.
Yeah, the status indicators API. I'd find whoever made that not happen and be like, yeah, you shouldn't still make it happen.
Do you think that's a pivotal moment in the history of the Linux desktop?
I feel like it's still relevant and highly irritating for a lot of people that are trying to use third-party applications.
Interesting. I would go back to the time when Unity was being developed. And I would try and coerce history to make Unity more available on other distros. So allow the developers who worked on it more time to package it up in such a way that it was acceptable on other distros, because it was actually pretty hard to package. And whatever reasons, like whether it's political or technical, make it available elsewhere and make them more amenable to changes from outside. So maybe change the fact that it was under a CLA or make it a more acceptable CLA to other people. And around about the same time, I would try and influence the way in which Compiz was developed, because Compiz 0.9 that was used by Unity was a rewrite in C++. And I think that was a bad idea, the way that was done. It was forked and rewritten in C++, and pretty much nobody else used it and nobody else packaged it. I think if it was possible for Unity and Compiz to be more friendly packaged in other distros, people might have been more accepting of Unity than they were at the time. And maybe it would have survived longer, and maybe it would have been more actively developed with more eyeballs. I don't know, but that's something I would have liked to have seen, is Unity available in more places.
Mine is somewhat related to that, and it's from around about that time, slightly before. What I would do is I would go back to just before GNOME Shell came out, while it was, in development, let's say, and I would get everyone together in a big room. I'd get people from Fedora and Red Hat and SUSE and Linux Mint and Ubuntu, and I'd get you all together and say, right, let's not have the clusterfuck that's about to happen, where GNOME 3, GNOME Shell comes out, and everyone says, that's terrible, we need to go off in our own direction, be that Unity, be that Cinnamon, be that Pantheon. I mean, you guys would be welcome as well, Dan. I would make sure that you all work together on this thing to make it better, to not make it single-threaded, to make it be something that is more extensible and more adaptable and will fit more use cases, and so that we don't have the fragmentation that we have now. Clearly, you're always going to have fragmentation, but we have more fragmentation as a result of that than anything else on the desktop, I think.
I don't think that's a bad thing. Like, people throw around this fragmentation thing, but I don't think it's fragmentation. I think it's diversity, and I think it's good. Like, we have a lot more options now for people to use their computer the way they like to. Like, imagine that, you didn't have the option to use XFCE. Let's go back in time to when that was done and make those developers work on GNOME instead. Wouldn't that be disappointing for you?
Yeah, but if I could use GNOME in a way that I use XFCE, then I'd be happy with it.
I don't know. I mean, I don't think that there's a way that we could be happy with just one desktop environment that's supposed to do everything. Otherwise, everybody would use KDE, right? Like, if that's what we all should work towards, is one desktop environment that you can turn into anything you want. Like, why everybody quit and use KDE because it already does that. But I don't think that that's what we want the desktop environment to do. Like, especially, for us in a lot of cases, when you start adding all these options and things like that, then it actually becomes less accessible to the people that we're targeting, that they're not interested in a build your own desktop environment kit. They want something that just works the way it works and is consistent and predictable.
Right. And that's what you have with GNOME and Pantheon. You have something that is not very configurable and is supposed to be just an out-of-the-box experience. But there's nothing stopping you having, deep in the settings somewhere, a toggle for expert mode or whatever that turns it into the Plasma desktop in terms of configurability. And you might even have a warning. You might have that option to ship a warning, hey, you probably don't want to do this, but here, the option is there. And you can please not all of the people, but you can please more of the people that way, I think.
There is a lot stopping us from do that. And it's the complexity of the system becomes such that you get bugs everywhere and inconsistencies, and all of a sudden you have weird interaction issues where, like, your app launcher overlaps your dock in such a way that you can't drag applications to the dock anymore, or you get some window stuck underneath the panel on something. Like, these edge cases start exploding once you add this kind of configurability, and then people go, this is a buggy mess, and it doesn't work, and then they don't want to use it anymore.
Yeah, so have a warning then.
People don't
warn
read,
people
Joe.
You probably shouldn't do this, and if you do it and experience bugs, fuck you, it's your fault.
Also, it means the developers have to support more code paths.
Yes.
Like, there's more ways in which the software can go wrong, as Daniel said, but it also means they have to support all of those various ways in which, you could put a warning that says, danger, Will Robinson, this is not supported. But like Dan says, nobody reads that, and they'll just say, well, this is a buggy mess because I flipped the switch that gives me advanced mode because you made it a thing that I could do. And now I end up with a black screen and my machine won't work, which is the worst case. And that makes the project look bad, when in fact they didn't want to support that out of the box anyway.
What we have, and I think is the best option, is free desktop. Like, free desktop is the way that we all work together while working on things that are different. And maybe that's a better time to go back to, is when free desktop kind of cooled down for some reason, because it seems like we keep trying to like bring it back, but for some reason we're struggling to figure out like how does free desktop collaborate and where, and that's been kind of an awkward thing to do. But I think that's the better path forward, is to have interoperability standards and not a GTK status icon API.
I think the other thing I would go back and change is the way that the, in inverted commas, shopping lens, or what some people call the Amazon lens, was implemented in Unity. I would beat people furiously about how that was implemented and how it was released, because that did so much damage to the Ubuntu brand, and people still bang on about it now. It's spyware. I get like on a monthly basis from some fucknut on the internet who knows better than I do.
Do you think you get less shit about snaps if you hadn't done that?
Not necessarily. I mean, they're two entirely separate things. But the Amazon thing, I find frustrating, because I think if it had been discussed before it had been landed, there could have been some discussion about how this feature works before everyone just said, they're sending all our key presses to Amazon, and they're spying on what you're doing, and all that kind of bullshit. I think could have been avoided if it hadn't just been landed in the distro at the last minute, which is what happened, with very little discussion or public planning. And also, I probably would have changed it so that it wasn't on by default. But, there's a whole bunch of changes that could have been done there and done better. And with hindsight, it's very easy to see. But it was incredibly frustrating at the time and for years afterwards. And I wish we could go back and erase that and change that.
I guess that happened as a product of trying to monetize desktop users, right?
To some degree. I mean, the desktop made money before, and it makes money now. It still makes like quite a bit of money in order to fund the development of Ubuntu. But, it's good not to have all your eggs in one basket and have a diverse way of making money. But also, it was to add a feature. It wasn't just there to generate revenue. It was to add a feature. And it's a feature that basically every other desktop now has, and every mobile operating system has. When you search for stuff, it searches not only the local device, but it goes online and searches online as well. Yeah, it wasn't implemented particularly well, and there were improvements that should have been made. And I think actually the backlash demotivated some of the developers, so they were less inclined to want to improve the thing because they just got flack at every turn. So yeah, I think it could have been actually a super useful feature, and the same thing is being baked into other operating systems because people want a single field in which they type something and it searches everything. And we saw that early on, but it was implemented badly, unfortunately.
Is charity a failure of society? As in, if society was structured properly, we wouldn't need charity. If you had a proper structure of government and taxes and fair distribution of wealth, then you wouldn't need charities. You wouldn't need to have food banks. You wouldn't need to have charitable causes raising funds and then spending it on stuff, because everything would just work properly.
Well, no, that's a super hyper simplistic view of the world, and you're describing communism. I think what's fair to say is that the governments of the world don't necessarily spend on what the residents of the world want them to spend their money on. And that's different in one country from another. But equally, even if you did allocate the right amount of cash to all the right things, so that there weren't food banks and so that there weren't your citizens going hungry, there would still be some idea that someone in your community would have where they want to achieve a goal, but they don't have the means to do it. And so they would solicit donations from the community in order to get that done, rather than go to government cap in hand and say, give me money to do my thing. They would solicit donations from the community, and that's charity, basically. So I don't think charity is inherently a bad thing, and I don't think it necessarily means that the governments of this world are doing things wrong. Some governments are doing things wrong, and sure, some governments aren't allocating money in a way that that reduces hunger and reduces the poverty in their country, granted. But I still think even if they did, charity would still exist.
I feel like I'm going to, for the most part, disagree because I live in a third world country where our single largest health provider is GoFundMe. And this is like a direct example of charity being a failure of government, right? Like if our government provided healthcare, healthcare funding more accurately, right? Like obviously the hospitals wouldn't be stocked by government employees, which is the weird counter argument. But if the government funded healthcare, then we wouldn't have this gigantic charity machine that's actually like a for-profit company to try to make up that hole, right? It would drive costs down. So it is a weird government failing there. And I think that in your example of somebody who's an entrepreneur or an innovator that wants to start a business, right? That's why I think that stuff like universal basic income is the future, because it will encourage and allow entrepreneurship. And the programs where they have run universal basic income in the past in smaller communities, there was a Canadian study where it enabled more marginalized groups to leave their circumstances. For example, women that entered into marriages because that was the only way that they could be financially solvent, right? They divorced their possibly abusive husbands so that they could become independent and pursue the things that they actually wanted to do. So I think that, yeah, in a lot of ways, when we see these charitable programs, it's because we have an economy that marginalizes and disenfranchises people.
It's funny that you said that the hospitals can't be staffed by government employees. I think that's pretty much how it is here. I think the NHS is essentially a government department. So people who work for the NHS are government employees, and it gets a bit of flack from people. But my experience of the NHS so far has been very positive, and I'm very happy with it. So funny you should say that. But yeah, that, far be it for me to start criticizing how your country works. But yeah, your entire healthcare system does seem to be a failure of society. I don't think it's fair to blame government, because government is not separate from the people. The government is elected by the people. It's made up of the people. It might be some of the more corrupt ones, but ultimately government is a reflection and part of society. So if you all decided collectively that you didn't want it to be that way, then in theory you could change it.
Yeah, but charity goes way beyond healthcare and minimum food and shelter. Like the RNLI, Royal National Lifeboat Institution, is a charity in the UK, and the only people it services are people at sea, people who have decided to venture out into the sea, which is not our natural habitat, ventured out in boats and come a cropper, and the RNLI go out and rescue them. I'm not slighting the RNLI. They're one of my favourite charities. But if you were a government spending money on a limited set of things, you've got a limited set of resources that you can spend on. You can't spend on everything. And so there's always going to be somewhere for charities to exist. And that's where I think I don't necessarily see it as entrepreneurship, because I don't see the RNLI as a business. But I think it's reasonable that a charity should exist for something which isn't an expectation that the government should pay for. Should the government pay for a organization that goes out and rescues people who, in their multi-million pound yachts, scooch about out in the ocean and then come a cropper when they hit rocks? Now, I'm not saying that that's what the only thing the RNLI do, but they do that. They do rescue people who have the means to be able to look after themselves, but a charity looks after them when they come a cropper. And that's what charities do. They're there to help people who aren't able to fulfill whatever it is they want to do right now.
I don't know if that's a fair argument. Like that, to me, that kind of sounds like, well, the fire department shouldn't service rich people because they could afford to hire their own firefighters.
No, it's not that they shouldn't. I'm just saying, should the government pay for it, or is it not reasonable? I think it is reasonable that a charity pays for it. That's my point, is that I think it's fine that a charity exists to rescue people out at sea. I donate to the RNLI. I'm almost never on any body of water because I'm a landlubber and I get seasick. But I respect the fact that some people need rescuing, and so I donate to that charity. And similarly, other charities exist that look after people who come a cropper in some way.
I mean, but that's like the core problem with like back to American health insurance, right? And they're like, well, I'm healthy. Why should I have to pay for that person that has a debilitating disease? Or why should I have to support such and such? I didn't choose to, go through sex reassignment surgery, or I didn't have a mental issue that, my childhood was great. Why should I pay for that?
Is that the government's problem or a history of America where it's seen that, every man for themselves and bring yourself up from your bootstraps and you're a self-made man and all that kind of bullshit?
I think that's the same issue, though, is just because someone lives a different lifestyle than you doesn't mean that we're not all people and we shouldn't all care for the citizens of our country.
I think the lifeboat thing is a bit of an edge case. And I think that, it does make sense that they are not a failure, because I think if you do want to go gallivanting around on boats and stuff and you get into trouble, then that shouldn't really be everyone's responsibility. And it should be people like you who choose to donate to help those people who help them out. But food banks is mostly what I'm thinking about here. I'm thinking about how it took a footballer to convince the government to give food to hungry children during this current crisis that we find ourselves in. It took a footballer basically to shame the government into doing that, and fair play to him and good on him for doing it, but it shouldn't have taken that. And we shouldn't be having to rely on charity for basic human needs and human rights. And so you can throw all the edge cases you want at me, and okay, that's sort of the exception that proves the rule or whatever. But I think for your basic stuff, you shouldn't need to rely on charity, and society has failed in that instance.
I take issue with it being an edge case because, if we sat here and spitballed for a while, I'm sure we could come up with a number of other charities that are not specifically about the basics of shelter and warmth and food. But is it the responsibility of the government to pay for all of those things? And it's not technically the government that pay for it, it's taxpayers. So it's all of us that end up paying for that. And there is a limited set of resources.
It's not that limited, though. I mean, when you think of the costs of these things in comparison to like the vast amount of wealth inequality, like it's not really that limited. Like if an individual like Bill Gates can eliminate a disease, how many other billionaires could we just shave a little bit off the top of to provide some basic necessities from our citizens?
Yeah, I've advocated this for a while. Tax the mega corporations like Amazon and eBay and Facebook and all that, and use that money for universal basic income. And then most charities wouldn't need to be a thing anymore.
It would eliminate a lot of the complexity for sure.
But is that just too simplistic? Is that what you're saying, Popey? That it's just, that's too much of a simple answer?
No, I mean, yes, but equally, I think there's room for other charities. I think the question wasn't framed that it's all about, healthcare and food banks. It was just a general, is charity a failure of government? And I don't think it is. As a broad brush, I don't think charity is a failure of government. I think governments are a failure of government and the tax system needs reform. Yeah, sure, I completely agree with you 100%. But I don't think there's anything wrong with charities existing per se.